Let me quickly see here the meeting. Perfect. I hope you can see already my screen. That would be helpful for this presentation. So my name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. I joined Microsoft 1.5 years ago, almost. Before that, I was obviously already very much involved within Microsoft, working on my stack, through virtualization. Did a lot of work in the hybrid space with Azure Stack, for example, and obviously a lot of Azure work. And then they finally got me, and I joined them. So quickly about, again, I don't want to spend too much time about me, but I often get a question, what does an advocate actually do? What is that? We are part directly of the Azure engineering team. So we're not in sales or marketing or any like that, like earlier roles. And our two really high level and overall things we do is creating content and delivering content. That can be, as right now, a user group presentation or conferences like Microsoft Ignite the Tour, Microsoft Build, and all of that. And then obviously we do create content, also like a lot of online content, especially when you look at blogs, videos, but also Microsoft Learn or Microsoft Docs articles. So if you want to learn more, by the way, about Azure and all that, I highly recommend that you check out Microsoft Learn. And then the other big part, and that is where I'm interested also to hear from you today, is that we collect feedback from our customers. So we are going to think about what actually works for our customers, what does not work, where can we improve the platform, and then we go back to the engineering teams and start talking with them how they can make the platform better. So let's dive in. And as you can see here, it doesn't say Azure Arc on my slide. It says Azure Hybrid, but no worries. We're going to talk about Azure Arc and how you can manage servers in a hybrid environment. However, I'm going to talk a little bit about hybrid in general, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the other features of Azure Arc, like Kubernetes management and bringing Azure data services, for example, into your data center. So if you want to hear about that, I also have a couple of things to share there as well. So let's just jump right in here. Before I talk a little bit, directly talk about Azure Arc, and I promise you I will have a lot of demos to show you actually how it actually works. But I want to first set a little bit of a context and why we actually developed Azure Arc and why it is so critical and important for our story. So when we look at our customers' environment, we see that these environments get increasingly complex. And obviously there are many reasons why this is happening, but there are three I want to highlight here. So the first one, if you look at IT departments today, IT operations, IT administrators, but also developers, they usually take care of tens or hundreds or thousands of apps which they need to manage. And some of them are really modern apps developed with modern languages. They are running on PaaS services in Azure, containerized, or even serverless applications, right? But then we also have a ton of traditional applications which are running inside virtual machines or even on physical nodes, right? And so IT operations or the IT department in general needs to take care of all these apps. Another big part is what we can see here is that a lot of customers are dealing with a very diverse infrastructure, right? They very often obviously run their own data centers, but they also use hosters and service providers to host their applications there. They also often have branch offices or multiple locations, factories or stores where they need to manage systems. And then they obviously, depending on what they're doing, you probably also have IoT devices at the edge and so on. So that is another big challenge to manage all of that. And then the last one really is when it comes to multi-cloud, right? And even though if a customer decides to go with Microsoft Azure as their main cloud provider, which by the way is an awesome choice, it can also be that they use other cloud providers as well, right? This can have multiple reasons. That could be that they are doing that historically. So like, for example, I saw many times that a company already started with another cloud provider, like a department started with that. And then they're probably not going to move everything over just to Azure just because now Azure is the main one and no one wants to spend like a lot of money on migration. But then there are also strategy decisions, for example, where customers say, hey, I like certain services in other cloud providers better, or they also just want to do that as a strategy in a way. I want to use multiple cloud providers just in case, right? And all that are fair points. However, it adds additional complexity to the environment. And those are some key points if you look at today's IT environments within companies. And I feel like again, this can be relevant to you if you're just a small company, but also if you're a large enterprise. And so what we've seen, and I'm very important, I highlight that slide. It's actually a picture I took during Microsoft Ignite 2019. That was last year. I think it was in November. And this on this slide, you can see here Jason Sanders, and he is the engineering lead of all the Azure engineering teams. So he's directly under Scott Guthrie, and he basically manages all the teams who actually developed the Azure services. And he had a keynote directly after Satya, where he also talked a lot about hybrid, right? Like Satya already talked a lot about hybrid last year, and then he was even going a little bit further. And I think I bring that slide because he said something very important, and that is hybrid is not just in-between state for our customers until they moved everything to the cloud. It's an end state for our customers, right? So we believe that customers really need hybrid. That can, and again, this can have multiple reasons. Those can be reasons like network latency, or you don't have network connectivity at all, or you don't want to rely on network connectivity to the cloud. For example, I have one good example of a customer which runs large factories, and they say, hey, we're going to use Azure. That's not the problem, but we don't want to rely on the internet connectivity for all that. We cannot risk that our whole factories are stopped when we don't have internet connectivity to Azure. So we need to have that hybrid construct to basically make sure that we can run the necessary stuff in our factories, for example, but then take advantage of the cloud for all the rest. And I also can see a lot of customers taking advantage. They say, hey, we're not ready yet to move everything to the cloud, but we're going to take advantage of the cloud to manage our environment. Again, this is very important. And then what I also want to mention on this slide, which is very important, is that hybrid, even though we are talking now a lot about it, it's not new, right? Azure was built with hybrid in mind. Microsoft has a rich history of using hybrid services. I think we just did sometimes not a good job in promoting that, right? So for example, if you think about management technologies, and I'm going to show you that a little bit, like update management for our servers, for example, we can use that for our machines in Azure, but also for our machines which are running outside of Azure. When we talk about security, like Security Center or Azure Sentinel, we can deliver that on both sides. When it comes to data services and SQL, for example, we are able to build that connection as well. And then if you look at our tools, and for example, also Azure DevOps, which is on one hand a service running in Azure, but then on the other hand, a solution which you also can download and install in your environment. I think that shows that we give actually customers the choice and have a look at their needs. So those are the base things I was just talking about. And I don't want to go too much on that slide because I have a next one which shows a little bit more about this. And again, this is just to make you clear what Azure Arc at the end does and what we are addressing with it. So when we start at this slide on the bottom, you can see here, hybrid can mean a lot of things. So for example, I'm not going to talk too much about this in this session, but if you're doing, for example, use our Azure IoT services to bring IoT to the edge and connect these to the cloud, that can be one scenario. We're also offering Azure Stack as a family, right? This is not like Azure Stack is not a single solution anymore. It's now a family of solutions. So we have, for example, Azure Stack Hub, which is formerly known as Azure Stack, which allows you to run Azure services or like an instance of Azure in your own data center, if you will. We have Azure Stack HCI, which is a cloud-inspired virtualization platform you can put in your data center, from very small system to very large systems as well. And then we have Azure Stack Edge, which basically allows you to put an appliance in your data center with as a first-party appliance. And then we are jumping now in with Azure Arc. So Azure Arc has 2 points here. Azure Arc, on one hand, helps us to bring Azure services to any infrastructure, right? Doesn't matter if it runs on a virtualization platform like VMware or at other cloud providers or on a Hyper-V cluster or wherever it's running. It can even be physical machines in your stores or in your data center. So that is one part Azure Arc will do, and I will show you how that will work. But another part Azure Arc is providing that single control plane, or Azure as a single control plane, by bridging the on-prem environment to Azure. And you hopefully see or heard what I did there. But this is really important. That is actually what we want to do, is especially use Azure as a single control plane for services which are running in Azure, but also outside of Azure. And I also want to quickly mention, when I talk about Azure Hybrid today, or when I say, hey, you can manage your on-prem server, with that, I always mean as well as other cloud providers, right? So Hybrid is not just in your data center and in Azure anymore. It's really in your data center, at the edge, in Azure, but also in other cloud providers. So it's on any infrastructure you can imagine. And so that is what we have to look at. So talking about a single control plane, this is, I think, the last slide before I jump into the demo. And here again, you can see here really about managing on-premise, multi-cloud, and edge environments. And what does that actually mean? So why would we actually want to have a single control plane? So what we can do today is really like organizing and govern our resources at scale, right? You know that when you're probably, a lot of you are using Azure for a long time already, and you probably also remember the times where we didn't have Azure Resource Manager. And so people realize that it's actually difficult to manage all the resources in a cloud platform itself, right? Because you have so many objects you need to manage. Like in Azure, everything is an object, like even an IP address, a network adapter, a database or a server, everything is an object, and you need to kind of like manage and govern these. And with Azure Resource Manager and the Azure governance tools like Policy and so on, we basically built the tools to manage these resources at scale. So people were asking, hey, why can we not just use these management tools which we use for Azure resources, but also for resources which are running outside of Azure? And that is where Azure Arc comes in as one example. And then obviously with Azure Arc, we want to also enable like the developer practices you have in the cloud to basically bring them to your on-prem environment as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, how that looks like in a bit. And then obviously the last one is really taking advantage of the security implementations we have in Azure, and then bringing that to your on-prem or again, other cloud provider as well. So that is where Azure Arc comes in. And I talked a little bit about the control plane, and I want to show you now quickly what that means. So I'm switching here to the Azure portal, and what you can see here, I hope this is nothing new for all of you, but this is the all resources view. So I can see here all my Azure resources, right? This is, with that you're probably all familiar. So you can see here I have my Azure firewall, IP addresses, routing table, virtual machines, network, security groups, disks, databases, app services, and so on. And with Azure Resource Manager, we already get some management tools here. For example, we can organize them by using resource groups or also subscriptions, and then all the resources are living or are connected to different Azure regions. Now mine are mostly in West Europe, and then I can use things like tagging to tag my resources to organize them. So for example, I can do cost centers, or I use a location tag here, for example, so I can easily find all the information I need, for example, when I do cost management. Now, again, as I said, people said, hey, this is great, but can we also add resources which live outside of Azure? And I want to quickly show you that. So instead of showing all resources, I'm going to filter here quickly for machines. Oops, sorry, going back. I want to unselect, and then I want to only show you the machines here. So I'm going to show you my Azure virtual machines, but also my machines joined using Azure Arc, right? So I'm going to select that. And so you can now see I'm only seeing virtual machines. So I see my Azure virtual machines now next to my servers, which are running outside of Azure, right? All these servers are running outside of Azure. You can see here I used the location tag. So for example, some of them are running in the Seattle office, in the New York data center, on my Surface laptop here, for example, as well. So you can see here, they look like Azure resources, but they're running outside of Azure. I can now, for example, also go and group them, so I can see a little bit of difference here between these resources, right? So I can see here all my servers. Again, you can also see that these are Linux machines as well as Windows machines, right? And they are, again, they can be virtual, but they can also be physical servers as well. Now, what I can do here, I can go further and say, hey, obviously I can now, since I'm using tagging, I can go and say, hey, I want to build a filter and just quickly show me all my servers now, all my machines from a specific cost center. So I'm going to select that. And then I'm going to just select cost center 1001. And now you can see here, it lists me my Azure VM as well as my on-prem server here. So I can easily get an overview about all my systems, doesn't matter where they are running. Now, again, you say, okay, this is great, I can have a look in the portal, but obviously you could also go and let's Resource Explorer, let's go to Resource Explorer. I can obviously also use certain APIs. So what I have here, I created already a list, so I can go out and, for example, use a query. This is the keyword query language, you know, like a lot of you probably know this as Custo, which right now with that simple query, I can just list all my Arc machines. And you can see here why I'm showing you this also is because this is the resource provider. It's called Microsoft.Hybrid Compute Machines. Those are actually the Arc machines. And so if I run this query, it will list me all my machines here, which I joined. And obviously I can use like CLI or PowerShell or APIs to do that. And then obviously I can also go and just list them side by side and probably group them and then run a query here. And you can see here, okay, I have 11 machines here outside of Azure and then 4 VMs running in Azure. And then if I need to show that to my manager, I can also create a nice chart with lots of color, which is always good. And I can see here, hey, okay, 11 there, 4 machines there, right? So it's not just the portal, it's also like queries you can run and automate that process, but it easily helps you to get an overview. Now, you probably say, okay, Thomas, like viewing my servers in the Azure portal, I mean, it's nice, but I want more, right? So we're going to have a look at more, and we're going to have a look at Azure policy. Now, before I'm going to talk too much about and show you the actual benefit of Azure Arc, I want to quickly make sure that everyone knows what Azure policy does. So Azure policy allows me to set certain rules for my Azure environment, right? So I can make sure that I'm like the deployments I do are actually compliant with my company policies. And so, for example, one thing you could do is like limit the VM sizes someone could use. So if you give your developers access to a subscription, you don't want them to go out to deploy the largest Azure virtual machines just for testing, right? I think we have now the MV2 series VMs, which have like 200 cores, 12 terabytes of memory, and they drain your credit card in 3 seconds when you start them. So you don't want everyone in your company going out and deploying these. You probably also don't want to make sure you don't want them to deploy servers in Azure regions where you shouldn't deploy these servers, right? So you can limit them and say, hey, I only want developers and IT to be able to deploy servers in my US regions, for example, right? So they cannot automatically deploy to Europe regions if you have certain regulations and other reasons for that. And then very important, so what policy allows us now to do is to keep control of our Azure environment without losing speed and agility to deploy stuff, right? I've seen people going out and saying, hey, we now have an approval process before someone can deploy something in Azure, right? And then you are back to like 2 weeks of deployment times for something, which is really not the idea of the cloud. So Azure policy can help you with that. And then what a lot of people don't know is that there's also something called Azure guest configuration policy. So if you want to make sure that your not just your Azure environment is configured securely. So for example, your VMs do not have public IP addresses if they don't need them. Or you can also make sure that the operating systems, Linux and Windows, are set securely, right? So what I want to show you here is how I would use such a policy. So I'm going to do an assignment. You can see here I can assign a policy or initiative. An initiative is just basically a list or a group of policies, right, to make it a little bit easier. So you can then set the scope. So you can set the scope on a subscription level, or you could set it on a management group level, or even on a resource group level, I think even down to a resource itself. And then you go and say, hey, okay, which definitions do I have? You can see here, if I select here, we have some built-in ones, which you can just start using for different compliance reasons, right? So you can have like different already predefined. So in the UK, they have UK official and UK NHS for the health service, so they can validate their Azure environment that they're actually compliant with that. And we have a couple of more. We also have for ISO and PCI, for example, as well. But in my case, I want to make sure that I check that my VMs don't have insecure password settings, right? So with that definition, we have a group of policies which go out and see, hey, do these VMs have insecure password settings? And I'm not going to assign this because I already have done that, because it will take a while to do the audit, and then we'll constantly audit your VMs. So when you now want to have a look at you go to compliance view, and you can see here I have a couple of assignments here. Some of them I'm compliant, so I'm a good administrator and most of my stuff is compliant. But then you can also see I have some things which are deployed in my subscription or my scope which are not necessarily compliant. So let's have a look at this one here. And that's the policy initiative I just showed you. And this goes out and basically audits the VMs, or better, the operating systems running inside the VM if they have insecure password settings. And you can see here I'm not compliant, so I have a couple of VMs and systems which do not basically have all these rules or are not compliant with that. So when you scroll down, you can actually see what all the rules are, or all the policies are, and you can see here a couple of them I'm easy compliant and some of them I'm not. So what I'm now interested in is what servers are not compliant, right? So if I go to not compliant, I can now see here my Azure Compute virtual machines. So this is a Azure VM, but I can also see my Microsoft Hybrid compute machines. So these are servers running outside of Azure, and I can now see, hey, they're also not compliant with my company settings, right? Very easy to use for Azure VMs, as well as now with Azure Arc for on-prem servers, or servers even running at other cloud providers. So how does that actually work? So let me switch back here to the slides. And no worries, I have more. I want to show you more. I'm going to show you how you add a server and so on. But I want to first show you how that actually looks like. So here we have an overview of the Azure Management. and how that actually works. And no worries, we will start on the left side. So if we, as an Azure customer, interact with Azure, we are basically using tools like the portal, PowerShell, Bash, the CLI, APIs, or like marketplace solutions whatsoever to basically interact and deploy stuff in Azure and manage stuff in Azure. When we do that using the Azure Resource Manager, right? I mentioned that before. That is basically the whole magic how things get deployed and managed in Azure. We can do role-based access control, logs, subscriptions, policies, searching, grouping, tagging. All of that comes from Azure Resource Manager. Now, on top, we also have obviously some management services like backup, update management, I mentioned that before, or monitoring, security center, and so on. And initially, this was all this like created, and Azure Resource Manager allowed basically to manage your Azure services. And we have, I think, now over 200 of these Azure services which you can manage. Now, what Azure Arc does is it extends Azure Resource Manager to connect services or resources running outside of Azure. And today that can be virtual machines or physical machines, like let's just say servers in general. It can be Linux and Windows servers. It can be Kubernetes clusters, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Or it can even be like Azure Data Services. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, because that is a little bit different, because this is not just adding like something existing. This basically allows you to deploy Azure SQL, for example, in your data center, right? And now you can basically see they show up now in the Azure Resource Manager. That means you can use it as I showed you in the portal, or using PowerShell or the CLI and so on. However, it's also important to mention that you can still, they're not there to replace your existing tools, right? It's not the idea that then you only need Azure right now, but it definitely helps. So you would still be able to use your Azure Data Studio, your Kubernetes native tools, or your server admin tools for your systems. You can still all use that to manage these resources as well. So you don't have a fixed dependency to Azure, but you get a big benefit if you can start managing that. Now, I would just want to jump in the next demo quickly, because I showed you now how can you actually manage these servers. So for that, quickly jumping back, and I want to show you how you manage Azure Arc, right? So for that, I'm just going to search for Azure Arc in the Azure portal. By the way, if you don't use the search that much, you should, because it's the easiest way to get from point A to point B. So I'm going to open up Azure Arc. And what you get is this view here. And you can see here, those are the 3 examples I made. So one of them is govern and organize all your servers. That's the one we're going to have a look at, which is currently in public preview. And then we have, for example, manage Kubernetes apps at scale. So also manage Kubernetes clusters, but also, for example, deploy apps using technologies like GitOps, for example, to make sure that you can also deploy our apps to on-prem Kubernetes clusters, or even Kubernetes clusters running at other cloud providers. So that is super interesting. This one is also in public preview. You can try both out today. And then the last one is in private preview, and that is actually the Azure Data Services part. And this allows you to run Azure SQL and Azure Postgres today in your own data center, right? So we had customers telling us, hey, we love Azure SQL. We love how simple it is, how it's a managed service, how we can easily scale it up and down, and how security is managed for us. But not all of our data can go into an Azure region because they are too far away, they have too much latency, they don't want to have the dependency, or they have regulations in place which don't allow them to store data there. So with Azure Arc, we now allow you to basically deploy these services on-prem. And again, I'm not going too deep into this in this session, but this is very interesting for many of our customers as well. So what I want to show you is actually the server management part. Now, before I'm going to show you how you add a server, I quickly want to show you here all the servers I added. And since I'm a owner of this subscription here, I can see obviously all the servers I added. And you can see here they're joined to a resource group, to an Azure location, to a subscription, and they have the type machine Azure Arc. Now, important here, I can now use here the same thing as I can do with Azure. I can use role-based access. So for example, if I'm the admin only for the file servers, for example, I can, for example, say, hey, and limit that and say, hey, you're only able to see these 2 file servers, right? I don't want you to see all the other servers or manage all the other servers. I can use now the role-based access I get from Azure and immediately start using that. So I already added a server here, and I hope I picked the right one. Well, let me go back. I'm going to pick this one here. This is the WAC server. This is a server running in my data center here, in my local data center. I know it says here other cloud provider as an example. My local data center, by the way, is just a small server running here behind my desk. I'm not really a data center, but you can get the point. So it looks like a Azure resource, right? So it is joined to a resource group, as I mentioned. I'm going to zoom in here. You get a Azure region, a subscription. As you can see, you can use tags. You can also have some additional information. So for example, it can be you get the computer name, which type of operating system it is, operating system version, and the agent version. And that is another great point. So and I'm going to show you that in a bit. How do I connect the server that it shows up here? It's basically an agent we install on top of the server, right? Again, this for Linux and Windows, we're just going to install the agent. I'm going to show you how that looks like. I also get here on the left side, I get the navigation here, so I can see, again, as I mentioned, role-based access controls. I can also use tags here, for example, as I did add a cost center or a location. And then I get also a couple of other interesting things here. So the first thing I want to show you, which is pretty new, which is I think we released this feature like 3 weeks ago, which is extensions. So if you have ever worked with Azure VMs, you're familiar that there are some VM extensions. Now, we extended this. You can now use these also for on-prem VMs. So here, you can see here I'm already using 2 extensions for that server. But if I want to add an extension, I just go and click Add. And you can see here, I can, for example, run the custom script extensions, which in the Windows case just allows me to run a PowerShell script. So I can say, hey, I want to run something against that server. I can do that directly from Azure. I can also configure PowerShell desired state configuration for that server. Or if I want to connect it, for example, to other services like Azure Log Analytics, Azure Monitor, Update Management, and many others, I usually need the Microsoft Monitoring Agent. So for that, I can just go out and deploy the Log Analytics agent here. And this will then deploy. Oops, was a little bit too fast here, maybe. And this would go out and deploy the Azure Monitoring Agent for that system. So the only thing I would need to add is the ID of my Log Analytics workspace and the key phrase, and I just click create and it will deploy that agent. Now, I have a couple of other features I want to show you. Now I deployed this already, so what I can do here now, the first thing I want to show you is the policy part. Now I showed you Azure Policy as a overview over all my systems, right? What I can also do is now, since I'm the server admin for that server and I'm responsible for that server, so I'm only caring about that server. So if I now click on policy, I can see here the scope is set to my server and I can see all the policies assigned to my server. So again, you can see that server here is pretty compliant with everything we have, but there are 4 assignments here, which I'm not compliant. And one of them, again, is the insecure password settings. And if you remember, I showed you that before. So I'm now, as a server admin, I'm now concerned and I have a look at what is actually wrong, like where I'm not compliant. So I can see the different rules here. And if I open this up a little bit, you can actually see what those are. So for example, the reuse of the previous 24 passwords and things like that, which are settings I need to change that they are secure. So I could now go out and do that manually, or I could also go out and create a remediation task to basically fix this, these settings, right? So instead of just going out, I can just go create a remediation task and say, hey, I want this server to be compliant with my policy. Another thing I want to show you is actually the log part. So I showed you that you can actually connect a server to Azure Log Analytics. So if I go to logs, I already have done that. Now, many of you know that this is not something new. I was able to deploy the Microsoft Monitoring Agent for a long time on my on-prem servers. But the problem always was when I wanted to give access to these logs, I would need to give access to the whole log analytics workspace, right? And so even if I have an admin which only should see the logs for a specific server, I need to give them the access. Now here you can see here when I look at the scope, I can only run queries now against that specific server. So I can again use the keyword query language here. And this one is a predefined one, which basically just lists all the update logs and all the update information. So I can see here all the updates from that system which are installed or which are needed, for example, and I can have a look at this. And obviously I can add much more logs, security logs, system logs, and so on, which I can have a look at to basically figure that out. This then also allows me to use things like, for example, change tracking. So if I go and I want to see the changes on that specific machine, I can just drill in here and I can have a look at it and I can see when changes are happening. I can also scroll down and can see here what happened at one specific time. So I see here a couple of services changed, probably during a restart or something like that. I can also have more information on this. I can also just get a software inventory of that system. So I would see, okay, what updates, for example, are installed, but I also get that this server now has, for example, the Azure Connected Machine Agent. That's the one we are installing to connect Azure Arc. And then we also have things like the Microsoft Edge, which I installed, for example, on that machine. So I've installed the browser on that server and I can now immediately see what is all installed. I think I can also go and I installed on that server like Windows Admin Center. So if I search and I hope, yeah, so you can see here, I installed Windows Admin Center. I can find that. I can see what version it is and so on. I can obviously see also the added registry keys or the Windows services here, for example, which are running or stopped, and get some information about that, what happens on that server. Now, while we're doing this, we also have update management. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this. Now, with update management, again, I was able to see the logs and I could go through and see all the updates which are needed and so on. But update management does that for me. So you can see here, this server actually misses 2 definition updates, right? Okay, that's not too bad. I guess that will be installed automatically in a bit. But you would also see if there is an update rollup available. And now let's fix this and actually patch that server. So for that, we can just go and create an update deployment. So I go to update deployment here, give that a name. In that case, we are just patching one server, right? So I'm selecting that name. I can define a maintenance window. I can select the reboot options. So reboot if required. That sounds good to me. And then I can go out and schedule it. So I can say, hey, update now, and then my server will be patched and rebooted if needed in the next couple, like 5 to 10 minutes. Or I can schedule it and say, hey, I want to have that outside of my work hour and basically schedule it. And I can even create a recurring task for it and say, okay, that should be patched like every Tuesday night, for example, or every month or whatever I like. And then I can also go and select which updates should be installed. I can also exclude and include updates if I wanted to. I can then run pre and post scripts, and then I just create that deployment, and this will then go out and update my server. So I'm not going to do this because of the time, but when this runs, you can then see here, for example, here are some deployments scheduled. you could also go out and find the history and find more information about how that went. However, this is not something new just related to Azure Arc. This just gives me more granular actions per server, right? So I can now go out and really just manage my on-prem server. Now, if I'm responsible for updates, I could also just go to my Azure Automation account where I run Azure Update Management, for example. And here you can see, I can see all my servers again, like I could see, like, remember back with the Azure policies. So I can see here my Azure VMs as well as my non-Azure systems. And again, Windows and Linux machines. I can see how they're compliant and what they're not compliant. And I could then go out and schedule that for a larger group of servers. And I could say, hey, I can also create groups. I could, for example, also create dynamic groups based on tags, for example, and say every server with that specific tag gets patched every Tuesday night, and so on. So that is about that. And you can also see that, for example, the same thing is true for change tracking I showed you before. So I can see all the changes happening here in that view with all my machines and get a software inventory from all my servers as well, right? So you can see here I have Windows services, but also Linux daemons because I have a couple of Windows machines here. So I can do that as well. So now the question becomes, one last thing I want to show you for that VM. Also very new is the possibility to now use Azure Monitor or enable Azure Monitor for my on-prem VM. So I can go out and I already enabled it for that machine. So now here I can see a dependency map, which basically shows me, okay, this server here connects to different ports, and they're like port 443. They have like 13 endpoints. So I want to see a little bit more what that is. And if I zoom in here, you can see here, okay, my server connects to these endpoints using the HTTPS connection. And I can see even more here if I wanted to. But also interesting, for example, if I scroll down, zoom in here, there are also other ports used. For example, I think this one is used, yes, like if I zoom in, this one here is used, for example, to connect to the domain controller. But I get a very nice map here to see what is actually going on. I can also go to performance and look at the server performance. So I can see what's going on with the disk, what is going on CPU, logical disk throughput, latency, network throughput, and so on. And this, again, is, you can use Azure Monitor for Azure VMs, but this VM is, again, running here locally in my home office. And I can basically go out and manage it from Azure. And again, this could also run in all the cloud provider. Now, imagine that you can manage everything from Azure and use it as a control plane. So the question becomes quickly, how do I now add a server? And I was talking about that agent. So to add that agent, you could obviously read the documentation, download the agent, and do all of that. But the team made it very easy by just clicking on add. They're giving you two options to help you. For the first one is we help you generate a script, which will basically go out and download the agent, install the agent, and then have a login prompt when you register the server to Azure. So that is what I'm going to show you in a bit. And then the other option is if you do that at scale, if you want to join like 100 servers or more, then you probably don't want to log in to all of these machines, and you don't want to log in on to Azure on all of these machines. So you can use a service principal name, which only has permissions to onboard servers. However, I want to show you the script because that explains also how we join the server. So obviously it needs to be joined to a subscription, and it also needs to be joined to a resource group. So I'm going to select these. I can then select a Azure region. Right now there are 4 regions, but keep in mind we are in public preview, so you can imagine that there will be more regions as soon as we come out of the public preview. Again, this is only to which endpoints is that server connecting to. It's not necessarily like we don't migrate the server or we don't move any data, right? It's just metadata where we connect. And then we say, okay, this is a Windows or Linux machine. In my case, I would say it's a Windows machine now. I can then use a proxy URL when my server is behind a proxy. I can already go out and add tags. So you saw that I was using tags for my machines. I can add them already when the server is joining, but I can also add them later. So in our case, we're just going to add them later. And then at the end, I just can download that script here, or I can have a look at it here. You can see if I zoom in here again, those are basically 3 steps. The first one goes and downloads the agent. It's on the Windows. In the Windows case, it's an MSI file, and then it installs that MSI file, and then you have the agent installed, and then you can basically go out and register. That's the last command. You get then that Azure Connected Machine Agent.exe, and that is basically where you can run different commands. And for example, with the connect command, you connect it to an Azure tenant, to an Azure subscription, to an Azure resource group, and then it basically shows up in the Azure portal. Okay, so let me quickly switch back to the slides. Quickly want to do a recap or like some key takeaways for Azure Arc for servers. Now, to start, again, Azure Arc for servers at this point, it really helps you to get an inventory of all your servers. That can be Windows and Linux. They can be physical or virtual machines. They can run in your own private data center or at a hosted cloud. They're completely domain agnostic. And then you can basically go out and govern and manage security for these servers, for example, using Azure policy and security baselines, and you can then see if they are compliant. And if not, you can basically take action on that. You get role-based access control. So if you're managing these, I mentioned you an example where you could just give, like, for example, if you have a SharePoint team, that they only can see their SharePoint servers and they can only manage these. And then if you are a managed service provider, for example, and you're using Azure Lighthouse to manage multiple customer environments and tenants, then Azure Arc also works with that. And then obviously you get all the central place to organize and manage these servers. So they are searchable, you get that inventory, you can use tagging, but you can also use tools like Azure Update Management, change tracking inventory, Azure Monitor, and all of that, basically with these systems. So I want to make a step back from what I just showed you, because that is not just everything Azure Arc can do, right? There is more to it. Azure Arc, again, that I showed you, can actually organize and govern across different environments, and that not just for servers, but also for Kubernetes clusters. So if you have your Kubernetes clusters, you also want to make sure that they are configured securely. So you can also use these policies I showed you for servers. We also have policies for Kubernetes clusters. So you can make sure that these are configured in the right way. And again, you can also then get that overview and manage these and all of that. In addition, you can also go out and do at-scale app management for your Kubernetes clusters. So it allows you to deploy and manage Kubernetes applications across different environments using kind of like DevOps techniques, using GitOps to deploy consistently from a source control. So you can basically just check in your code, and then that will then get deployed if you want to. And you can configure that using Azure Arc. And then the last one, I talked about it, is really running Azure data services anywhere, right? Wherever you want to have Azure SQL, with Azure Arc, you can go out and deploy your Azure SQL, even in your own data center or even at another cloud provider. And so that is really, really powerful as well. And now a little bit for the technical part here, I want to also quickly highlight that a little bit. Again, we start on the left side. This is really like the technical view on it, how it looks like. Again, if we are managing Azure resources or Azure in general, using the portal, the CLI, PowerShell APIs, or the SDK, and so on. And as I mentioned, we are interacting with Azure Resource Manager, which provides us with a lot of different things like identity, role-based access, policies, groups, and so on. Now, the blue part here, you can see that we have different resource providers or RPs. And if we start at the bottom, the thing I showed you was the Azure Arc server resource provider, which basically then like an agent which you can install, then connects to that RP and allows you to manage servers, Linux and Windows. And then we have the same thing for Kubernetes cluster. We have a Kubernetes Azure Arc Kubernetes RP, and then you deploy an agent on your Kubernetes cluster, which then helps connects to the RP, and you can manage that. Now, interesting is when you then bring in the Azure Data Services part. So we also have obviously a resource provider for that, but that is actually deployed on top of a Kubernetes cluster. So if a customer wants to run Azure SQL in their data center or their location of choice, the only thing they will need as a starting point, they will need to have a Kubernetes cluster, and then the Azure Arc deployment will then deploy everything which is needed containerized on that Kubernetes cluster. And again, you can still use your tools you were using before for Azure SQL. That would be, for example, Azure Data Studio. For Kubernetes clusters, you have a ton of different Kubernetes tools to manage these Kubernetes clusters. And same thing on the server side. So again, depending what you're using for Linux or Windows servers, you can keep using these as well. On the Windows server side, for example, you have things like Windows Admin Center, which also perfectly works there. Good. I want to close my session, and again, I will have time for some Q&A with doing another step back again. And this is very important to me. You saw that same slide with the picture of Jason Sanders at the beginning. Azure Arc is not the only hybrid service we have, right? Because this is probably the newest one, the one we talked right now about it. But obviously, we have a ton of management services like Azure Update Management, like Azure Automation Hybrid Workers, for example, which work already for a long time. We have in the security space, you can add servers to Azure Security Center. You can use Azure Sentinel as a cloud-based SIEM solution. And I talked about the other ones as well. We also have the IoT suite, if you will, like the IoT services. There are a ton of different services. So if you're working with IoT, you can use that as well. And then most interestingly, people often then ask, okay, now I have Azure Arc. Do I still need Azure Stack? And the simple answer is yes, because they're kind of they're solving different challenges, right? They're solving different challenges in a way that Azure Arc really gives you that control plane and allows you to deploy services. But Azure Stack, or the Azure Stack family or portfolio, is a set of solutions which allow you to actually give you hardware and infrastructure into your data center or edge location, or wherever you want to call it. And again, I mentioned the free solutions we have there with Azure Stack Hub, Azure Stack HCI, and Azure Stack Edge before. But while solving different challenges, they also integrate very well together, right? So imagine you probably want to have a Kubernetes cluster running on top of an Azure Stack. That looks great. So we gave you AKS engine on top of Azure Stack Hub in your data center. And then with Azure Arc, you can basically go out and connect that Kubernetes cluster to Azure using Azure Arc. And so you can manage it from Azure as well. So you get that combination of different services together. So I feel like that's just pretty powerful. And again, these addresses sometimes a lot of questions I get around this. So don't make Azure Arc is not the only hybrid story we have there, but they also all can integrate into each other. So with that, I want to say thank you very much, and I want to take the time to go a little bit into questions for that. And I also heard that you're also absolutely free to open up your mic and ask your question as well.
Thanks, Thomas. It was a great presentation. I think it was very informative and it's going to be super helpful. We did receive a couple of questions on the chat. The first one is from Casey, who has asked, for the Azure Arc machines in other clouds, will it show the regions those machines are in for that cloud provider on the page?
So that's a good question. So what it will show, like as a location, it will show the Azure region you connect that machine to. So like at the last, almost at the last demo, I think I showed you where you can like that have the drop down and select the region. That is what it will show as the Azure location. However, I'm using tags to have that more granular because imagine if you have, for example, also two offices in the same city, or like in Switzerland, we have your company, like the company has multiple locations. So it can, but it connects to all to the same Azure region. So it will be, I use tagging to make that clear where that is hosted.
All right, I think that answers the question. The second question is from Nikhil, who has asked, can APIM be integrated with Arc to use internal APIs from on-prem?
So that is yes. So that is a good question. There is absolutely a way to integrate API management. I think there is a blog post and some documentation out there how that would look like. I will need to figure out where it's hosted because I haven't really spoken about that. That's why it's good. I would need to check, but there's definitely documentation. I think you will just find it just fine if you're looking for Azure Arc and API management.
Okay. Those are the only two questions I see on the chat. Does anyone else has any other questions for Thomas before we wrap up this presentation? I guess with that, we can assume there are no more questions. Thank you so much, Thomas, for the presentation. I really appreciate you taking out time for speaking to the group. Thank you so much.